Hi guys, there were a couple things that I wanted to talk about and address as a follow-up to my Jane Doe guide, my impressions, and so the topic of today's video will be dispelling any myths or maybe addressing some questions that you might have had regarding Jane Doe. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now the first thing we have to talk about is her W engine, and specifically because one of the most common questions that I get when it comes to Jane Doe is should you pull for her signature or should you get her first Mindscape? Her W engine is pretty good because it gives you Anomaly Proficiency, and it also does give you physical damage alongside the additional Anomaly buildup rate increase. Meanwhile, for her first Mindscape, not only does she increase the number of Salcho jumps she can use, which is really nice for extending and increasing how much Anomaly she applies, she also gains an additional Anomaly buildup rate by 15%, and each point of her Anomaly increases her damage by 0.1%, up to a maximum of 30%. To be clear, this will be achievable assuming you have any commitment or any W engine pertaining to Anomaly Proficiency, so it's not as though getting the 30% will be difficult, but that still leaves us with the question, which one should you pick? Well, thankfully, I have a few sources here, including Pridewin and my good friend iWinToLose, who've done a lot of specific calculations for this exact question. Now, something that you might notice from the charts that you're seeing here is that the actual difference or the improvement from M0 to M1 is around a 13 to 18%, depending on which factors you're taking into consideration and depending on which calculations you choose to look at. But when you take a look at the W engine impact, the difference between the W engines is also kind of similar. Now, depending on certain factors, like if you have a certain number of stacks, depending on what encounter you're in, and of course, whether or not you are fighting in a isolated stun kind of window, or if you're just staying on field 24/7 with Jane, the performance of the signature W engine as opposed to its alternatives will vary. The difference between a signature W engine and an A rank W engine and M0 and M1 is pretty similar. And before you immediately state, well, based on this, you should definitely just get M1 because it looks like it's 18%. And on average, it's going to be what, roughly a 16% increase, and it's more worth it for you to get an M0. Consider these two things first. Number one, if you're using a W engine like Electro Lip Gloss or Weeping Gemini, the conditions for these W engines are actually pretty important to take into consideration. Sharpened Stinger, for instance, requires you to do a lot of dash attacks, dodge counters, dashing in general, where if you are using something like Rainforest Gourmet, although you will be doing a little bit less damage, it does mean that you're able to more easily activate its bonus. So that's kind of a con already. If you're trying to use something like Sharpened Stinger, maybe it's a little bit more difficult for you to maintain stacks. And so you might think based off of that, well, I might as well just get the Mindscape. Pause, because if you're familiar with anything relating to gacha, and specifically with Hoyoverse, you'll know that the way that pulling for characters in ZenlessZoneZero is actually different than some of the other gachas. Unlike a game like Wuthering Waves or some other gacha games where maybe there aren't even any W engine or weapon gachas at all, for ZenlessZoneZero specifically, there's a 75-25 pity for W engines, whereas for the character gachas, it is still a 50-50 for whether or not you actually get the character when you pull on their banner. Now, you may think that this isn't that big of a deal, or it might not be something that worth looking into because it's not based in math or have to do with performance, but that is actually a pretty significant thing to consider when you're pulling for someone. So even if the math shows that from M0 to M1 is better, you do also have to take into consideration that monetary wise, which is again a huge factor for some players, it's not actually that easy to get M1 as opposed to getting the signature W engine, all things considered because of how difficult the 50-50 is and how much more likely you are to literally get the W engine on a 75-25. Now, again, based on what we've seen from here, it does feel like the signature W engine is a little bit more difficult to deal with. And if you're a casual player, not really looking too much into how to play Jane and you just want to left click 1,000 times, it may be better for you to just use something like Rainforest Gourmet, use your EX special when you can, and then just get M1 Jane. As a reminder and a disclaimer, not giving any specific financial advice, but just take into consideration or remember that M1 has way less conditions for making it work, as opposed to, of course, the signature W engine, which is based more around dash attacks. So now with that out of the way, I want to talk about arguably the second most overlooked or maybe misunderstood topic that I've gotten asked about when it comes to Jane Doe, regarding pretty much her stats and Anomaly Proficiency. Now, of course, being given a specific stat line can sometimes be difficult to suggest or maybe difficult to achieve, but specifically for Jane Doe, her stats are a lot more important than you think, and that's specifically when it comes to Anomaly Proficiency. The main reason for this is because if you take a look at her basic attack, passive, skill, whatever you want to call it, specifically with Passion, she gains additional attack when she hits a certain anomaly proficiency, and this is also reflected in her core passive, where she gains crit rate also based on her anomaly proficiency. Now, in case you didn't believe me, like a few people randomly did for some reason in the YouTube comment section, I decided to leave it to ChatGPT. I plugged in literally the entire passive and I asked ChatGPT exactly how much anomaly proficiency you needed for both of the passives, and based on this, pause if you want to read, you need 375 total anomaly proficiency if you want to have 100 crit rate on your Jane Doe with her assault anomaly, but that's not actually that relevant, specifically because if you are trying to instead get the max attack value from her passion state, you will need a total of 420 anomaly proficiency, aka 300 additional anomaly proficiency, to actually gain the 600 total attack. Now, I'm sure this needs no explanation, but getting 420 anomaly proficiency is now the baseline or foundation for how you basically build your Jane Doe, and this makes sense because attack percent obviously increases the damage that your assault does, and of course having more anomaly proficiency always gives you more damage too. In case you were considering other options, there aren't really any other substats or stats in general that you could look to. Crit rate and crit damage as substats, just as a side note, also don't affect Jane's assault anomaly, which is 99% of her damage basically. So in that case, it's not worth it for you to commit to crit rate or crit damage. Getting her HP and defense doesn't make sense either, since she's dodging all the time, and this is more of an offensive gacha game, not so much a defensive gacha game. So with that in mind, attack percent and anomaly proficiency is really important, and getting the 420 is going to be your main goal. So these are the two breakpoints that you need to take a look at, courtesy of ChatGPT. Now, the next topic I want to talk about is specifically for Fanged Metal and Freedom Blues. Now, for her disk drive sets, you could take the very straightforward and easy way of thinking, oh, well, Fanged Metal is physical damage, I have a physical anomaly character, there's no way I would use anything but Fanged Metal. In most cases, you would be correct. However, there are people that were questioning or concerned with whether they could just run Freedom Blues, because as you're reading right now, when Jane uses her EX special attack, you can reduce the target's anomaly buildup resistance for physical, or for specifically Jane's anomaly, by 20% for 8 seconds. Now, keep in mind that this passive does stack with her additional ability. There isn't any conflict of interest here. However, what you need to remember here is that although the reduced anomaly buildup resistance is really nice, you do also need to do damage, which is why a lot of times things like damage percent or physical elemental damage specifically is so important. Furthermore, when you consider that the assault damage that you have here increases the second assault, not the first, that you apply on a character like Jane, Fanged Metal definitely climbs out ahead. It is worth mentioning that things like anomaly built-up resistance being stacked together is not always a bad thing. However, something that is definitely worth looking into and researching before you blindly just pick Fanged Metal or Freedom Blues is how quickly or how often you're actually applying assault to an enemy. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I referenced the video from my friend I Win to Lose regarding his thoughts on Jane as well. And the thing about his video is that a reoccurring theme that he brought up was that for certain breakpoints or for certain choices in his build, it is dependent on who you're fighting, because certain enemies will be assaulted or have their attribute anomaly applied way faster, and others will die at the snap of a finger. And so, because that is the case, it does actually matter for you to to research or gauge the damage that your Jane is doing, specifically because sometimes applying more anomaly resistance will not actually be better than you just doing a bunch of damage in one burst and ending the fight there. That question specifically, however, is why some players are debating on choosing Anomaly Mastery over attack percent and vice versa. Is it better to have a more impactful burst window, or is it better to consistently apply assaults faster? And the answer is there is no one single answer. Some fights are easier to one-shot enemies on, and some fights, like against certain robots or against certain very difficult disputed node enemies, it'll actually take a lot of time to apply attribute anomaly to them, and in which case, your actual choice may switch from attack percent to anomaly mastery or vice versa. It's hard to tell, and I apologize because there, again, is no one solid answer, but that's just the way that the game has been designed and that enemies have been designed as well. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the team compositions, because there has been so much talk about what is the best Jane composition, what she's best with, is Seth really good, who needs to be paired with who, and why. And I wanted to kind of break down some of my thoughts with the specific characters that she can be tied with, and what to expect when you're playing each team composition. Now, the team that you see right before you is arguably one of the most common teams, assuming you have Qingyi, and assuming you just love playing with, I guess, police officers. This is the Jane, Seth, Qingyi team composition, and the idea behind this is that you have a stunner, you have Seth to buff up your Jane with an anomaly proficiency buff, and you daze infinitely, you stun, and then Jane ends up blowing up everything on screen. This is what I'd call the Jane hypercarry composition featuring a stunner. Now there is another variation of this which I'll be covering in a second. However, this is primarily for players that want to spend most of their time on Jane, and that's basically what you're doing. However, keep in mind that because you do have a stunner, if you are playing someone like Qingyi, unless you are committing only to Qingyi using her follow-up assists or using her dodge counters, you actually will have to spend a decent amount of time on Qingyi as well. But personally, what I found is that after you apply Assault on Jane, you actually don't spend too much time at all on Qingyi, and most of the time you'll end up bursting down the enemy during Qingyi's stun window, specifically with Jane once she's been buffed up. And you can, in some cases, even get 3 assaults off in one stun window, depending on how clever and how well you time out your abilities, which is really important, but that's the whole playstyle. Now, I mentioned the hypercarry team composition earlier, but guess what? There's an even more straightforward, technically, way to play Jane as a hypercarry, and that's with Jane, Seth, Lucy. Now, this has been gaining a decent amount of popularity. Number one, because who has Qingyi if you're someone that was saving for Jane? And otherwise, some players don't have characters like Grace, so naturally they will rotate around or gravitate towards a team like Jane, Seth, Lucy. Lucy gives attack, Seth gives Anomaly proficiency. It's kind of a match made in heaven, and you get to spend 99% of your time on field with Jane, which is super great. Now again, this is a super similar composition to the Qingyi and stun hypercarry composition that I just mentioned earlier, but rather than focus on trying to stun or unload everything under a certain window, what you're actually trying to do is maintain the buffs from Seth and Lucy, and so long as that's happening, guess what? You don't have to switch off of Jane at all outside of follow-up assists, which again will immediately result in a quick assist, which doesn't matter at all anyways. So this is a very high Jane uptime team composition, and it's one of the reasons why it's so popular. Everyone loves seeing Jane on field, me included, by the way. So therefore, if you want to see Jane 99% of the time, feel free to use Jane, Seth, Lucy, though in most cases, Jane, Seth, Lucy does perform equal to, if maybe not a little bit worse than Qingyi, which makes sense because Qingyi's a 5-star. Now, before we leave the hypercarry team composition, I do want to also say, because it's been talked about quite a bit in my comment section as well, there have been some scenarios where Jane being paired with Rina also works well alongside Seth, but it kind of depends on what mindscape you have and what fight you're fighting on and what fight you are encountering. Sometimes Rina does end up performing a little bit better, but it's mostly when you don't have to swap off as much and you are perfectly timing everything. But that's usually only when you have M1 on Rina, and mindscapes on standard banner characters are not the most uncommon ever, especially if you lose your 50-50s like me. However, if you don't have M1 on Rina, you do actually have to spend a lot of time swapping over, which can be really annoying, all things considered. That being said though, if you do have Rina, or if you were someone that was playing something like Grace, Piper, Rina beforehand, it definitely makes sense if you want to use your M1 Rina, or use your Rina if you want to split your Lucy off to another character and end up using Rina for this team. And now finally, I want to talk about the final team composition and the way it plays, and that's the Jane, Seth, Grace team, aka the Disorder team. Now, there is a lot of discussion and debate about how you're supposed to play this team out, and the truth is that it's, again, very dependent on the fight that you're encountering. Personally, as always, I like starting off the fight by assaulting whatever enemy it is, specifically with Jane, so that I start getting more days, and I get to apply either Disorder through Seth plus Grace, or some combination of that. How you choose to play that composition is definitely up to you, and I'm certainly no master of how to play the Disorder team. However, the biggest thing about this team is that it allows you to do a lot of burst damage in a lot of time, while also applying constant days, even while not having a stunner. If you've seen some of the footage when it comes to a team like Jane, Seth plus Lucy, you'll notice that there is a lot of damage being done by a character like Jane, who's been buffed up and is on occasion getting assists or follow-ups from Seth and Lucy, but they definitely don't apply nearly as much days as other characters, and that makes sense because it's 2 supports plus Jane. However, with Disorder and the fact that you are effectively using way more EX specials on a team that actually has reason to swap off onto other characters, you will find that stunning on a Jane Grace team is actually a little bit easier than a double support team. But of course, this pales in comparison to the Qingyi team, which is, well, a literal stunner on the team, and that makes sense. So long story short, there are a variety of different compositions you could play when it comes to Jane, and each one kind of depends on how you want to play her. If you don't mind sharing the field with another character, feel free to play Disorder. If you are someone that loves seeing Jane 24/7 like I am, well, maybe you'll end up using something like Seth and Lucy instead. And now one of the last things I want to touch on is the W engine, because aside from whether you should be pulling for her signature or for another Mindscape, there has been a lot of chatter over which of the W engines is best used. Arguably speaking, this is one of the most slept on W engines of all, which is Rainforest Gourmet. And this is specifically because, well, if you've ever seen any calculations, as you saw earlier, Rainforest Gourmet does end up performing way lower compared to some of the others. Let's actually take a look at what the passive says though. It reads, for every 10 energy consumed, the equipper gains a buff that increases attack by 4% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. This is very easy to use because all it's insinuating is that you have to use your EX special. Plain and simple, very easy to use. Since it does end up performing a little worse, maybe you don't want to use this. So let's take a look at another one like Electro Lip Gloss. Now, Electro Lip Gloss reads that when there are enemies inflicted with Attribute Anomaly on the field, the equipper's attack increases by 16% and they deal an additional 25% more damage to the target. Now, of course, this is really good because it's 16% attack and it's also additional damage, but you do have to already be hitting a target that has been inflicted with Attribute Anomaly for you to even gain any of these bonuses. And if not, you literally don't have any bonus at all. It's just 75 Anomaly proficiency, and that first window or that first time that you end up applying or hitting an enemy with Anomaly or Assault, it doesn't do any more damage. Now, this is where a lot of concerns lie with Electro Lip Gloss, and it makes sense. If you are in a scenario where you're only doing 2, maybe 3 attribute anomalies total, it's basically a third of your damage that isn't affected by the Electro Lip Gloss passive, and therefore it is worth looking into for whether or not it's actually worth it. There's even one other thing that we haven't talked about here, which is, well, Electro Lip Gloss is a Battle Pass W engine, and currently, as of right now, you would have only had up to 2 Electro Lip Glosses because this is only our second Battle Pass. Now, if you are someone that is looking way down in the future, and if you're someone that just loves playing Attribute Anomaly, then by all means, maybe in 3 more Battle Pass rotations, this may end up being one of the best Attribute Anomaly weapons ever. But that's assuming no other Attribute Anomaly character ends up coming out that has a decent enough weapon that would overtake the Battle Pass. Meanwhile, by comparison, if you are playing someone like Seth and you don't get his W engine, by the way, his options are really bad if you don't get Spring Embrace. But let's talk about the final performing W engine, which is Weeping Gemini. And this reads, whenever a squad member inflicts an Attribute Anomaly on an enemy, the equipper gains a buff that increases Attribute Anomaly by 46, stabbing up to 4 times. And the effect expires when the target recovers from stun or is defeated. Now, of course, we have something to talk about here. What is this referring to? How many stacks are you actually going to get? Is it realistic for you to even stack this several times when the target can recover from stun? All these things are valid questions, and this is actually more of a team composition thing than anything else. Weeping Gemini specifically states that the effect and the anomaly proficiency that you gain only lasts so long as the target doesn't recover from stun or so long as they're still alive. Now, the thing is that if you're running something like Chang'e, if you end up applying attribute anomaly like Assault on the enemy a few times, that's great. But if you end up applying a stun with Chang'e immediately after, the second that the window is over, Weeping Gemini resets back to 0 and you lose all your damage bonus. This is a pretty important W engine, therefore, to keep in mind when it comes to its passive, specifically because if you don't basically kill in the first burst window, you're gonna have to restack all your passives again, which is of course a pain in the butt. Now, based on, again, I win to lose this chart, this does end up being pretty good, assuming that, again, you get something like 2.5 stacks, but something like 4 stacks, which is calculated here at the top, ends up outperforming most other things except for maybe a sharpened stinger at max, which is fine because one is obviously the signature W engine, but the other is a 4 stack, count it, 4 times assaulted enemy for you to then gain the amount of damage to reach the 118% threshold. So of course this is a little bit impractical, and on average it ends up performing roughly similar to Electro Lip Gloss. This leaves us with the question, which of these W engines should you be using, or which one do I recommend? And although I did end up recommending in the video Rainforest Gourmet, there were still people that kind of gave pushback, but I want to re-emphasize again, if you are someone that isn't thinking too much about your gameplay, or if you don't want to count stacks, count how many times you've been hit, count where you are specifically fighting, anything like that, Rainforest Gourmet by far is going to be one of the best performing W engines for you, because you just close your eyes, you press left click 10 times with Jane Doe, and boom, they're immediately gone so long as you press your EX special right before you do it. Now, again, I do think that Electro Lip Gloss and even Weeping Gemini perform quite well, especially since Jane in some cases isn't getting a stunner like in the Seth Lucy team composition, and I have seen sometimes getting 3 assaults, even sometimes 4 assaults in the same rotation, depending on who you're fighting against, and that bonus damage starts to add up. And as that gets applied as assault damage, that is huge. That is significant, and it does end up comparing to something like the Stinger. But again, whether or not that's going to be practical or realistic for most fights, I think not, and therefore I would say that Rainforest Gourmet is the W engine of choice. Okay, and now there is one final thing I felt was important to talk about when it comes to Jane Doe, and that's, where does Jane Doe spawn? Believe it or not, this is actually something that most people don't think about, and maybe you haven't taken a look at or haven't seen her, but the locations that I've seen Jane spawn at and the times that I've seen her spawn in at, usually in the morning or at night, it kind of varies and it fluctuates, but unlike some other characters where they only show up at certain times or on certain locations, I've only ever seen Jane specifically in the Lumina Square, or specifically in 6th Street. Obviously, there is a moment where if you call her to your house, she'll end up in random play, but these were the only locations that I found thus far. But these were the only locations that I've seen thus far that have Jane in them. Special note as well, in case you were curious, Jane also does sometimes show up in the absolute middle of the night, like literally whatever this is, the deepest, darkest blue part is when she also sometimes shows up, and she'll be roaming around in the alley. She'll take you on some activities. That's another thing that you can add onto your belt if you didn't already know. But that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Thanks again for watching. Hope you guys learned something. I apologize, this is basically a continuation of the guide or some of the first impressions, and I just had some additional thoughts or some concerns with some things that people were talking about or discussing, and I wanted to clear up some things or give my insight as well. Thank you again for watching though. Again, if you made it this far, make sure to check out the rest of my socials. I appreciate it so much. I will see you guys on the next one though. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.